Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Jason Marczak. I'm the director of the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. It's great to see so many familiar faces, but also new faces here today, and thanks for all of you joining on live stream. This is a discussion day around the launch of one of the most important topics, a report around one of the most important topics today, the future of NAFTA. It's a conversation you can also join on Twitter using the hashtag ACNAFTA. We tackle here some of the most pressing issues for Latin America and the United States in the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center, and I can think of few more crucial issues these days than shining a spotlight on NAFTA and why so much rests on getting these negotiations right. Millions of people depend on it, and the truth of the matter is many people don't even know that they depend on it. I'm thrilled to welcome one of the leading thinkers and doers in the trade space, Ambassador Bob Zoellick, along with Congressman Will Hurd of Texas, a leader in his own right, who will each provide comments. And of course, it's always such a pleasure, Adrienne, when you can join us. So thank you very much for joining us. Adrienne, as all of you know, is a business leader and philanthropist who's laser focused on making the world a better place. So thank you. This morning we were asking a question that I hope only ever remains theoretical. And that question is, what would happen without NAFTA? And it couldn't be more timely. Next week, negotiators from the United States, Canada, and Mexico will come to Washington for the fourth round of renegotiation talks. The first three rounds have been in many ways a warm-up of what's to come in the next round and beyond. Negotiators will begin to more concretely put on the table proposals around some of the thornier issues, from rules of origin to the Chapter 19 dispute resolution mechanism, and of course discussions on the trade deficit, with ideas like a sunset clause receiving recently more and more public attention. As Prime Minister Trudeau highlighted when speaking at the Atlantic Council's Global Citizen Awards a couple of weeks ago in New York, Canada, for his part, will push for what he's calling a progressive trade agenda. This all comes against the backdrop of the EU-Canada FTA going into effect just 2 weeks ago, and Mexico and the EU looking to conclude FTA talks by year end. And of course, I couldn't forget that both continue to plug away to strike a comprehensive deal with Asian and Latin American counterparts as what is now referred to as the TPP-11. Our Mexican and Canadian partners are clearly looking at how to further diversify trade partners, but the reality is that there's no escaping the importance of North America. And that is why these negotiations can be such an opportunity, a chance to modernize an agreement that is in serious need of this modernization. We can create an agreement that serves as a template for the next generation of trade agreements, one that takes into account not only how much the world has changed since 1994, but also looks ahead to how the world will change in the years ahead and lays the groundwork for ensuring North America's global competitive advantage. But again, with patience sure to wane at different points of what is likely to be a long negotiation period, with elections in the United States and Mexico next year, we must keep sight of what happens to the United States and to our neighborhood if NAFTA were not to exist. What happens to U.S. jobs, to U.S. competitiveness, to the farmer in Iowa, or to the price of a family's weekly shopping bill? By raising these questions, we hope to show why it's a path that simply cannot be taken. The report being publicly launched today looks country by country at what happens without NAFTA and what the corresponding effect is on the United States. Javier Mancera does this from a Mexican angle, Daniel Schwanen from a Canadian perspective, and Phil Levy from a U.S. angle. My colleague Catherine Pereira and I rounded out with insight into the strategic imperative of NAFTA and how it helps to keep the United States more secure. As we prepare to enter more challenging rounds of negotiations, this report and our findings put a spotlight on how crucial it is that we are successful. Now, to begin the conversation, I am very pleased to introduce Congressman Will Hurd. Congressman Hurd is in his second term in the House. He serves on the Committee of Oversight and Government Reform and chairs the Information Technology Subcommittee. He also sits on the Committee on Homeland Security and is the vice chair of the Border and Maritime Security Subcommittee. And this year, Congressman also added to his portfolio, serving now on the House Permanent Select Intelligence Committee. Representative Hurd is deeply knowledgeable about the importance of strong U.S.-Mexico ties. He's born and raised in San Antonio, Texas, and represents a district that spans the southern border from El Paso all the way to Eagle Pass. And as I just learned, the congressman represents the largest span of the U.S.-Mexico border of any congressman in the House. He's also part of the U.S.-Mexico Interparliamentary Working Group. With the group, he traveled to Mexico earlier this year to discuss ways to enhance our bilateral relationship. The congressman will give remarks. He unfortunately does not have time for questions. He has to get back to the House for votes. But it's a real honor to have you, Congressman. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Well, I want to thank the Atlantic Council for having me here to begin what I think is going to be a great morning. Before I make a couple of points, what I want to do is set the stage and give you a little bit of my background so you understand my perspective when it comes to these issues. So I was born and raised in San Antonio, and I went to Texas A&M University where I was getting a degree in computer science, and I had never been outside of Texas, and it was my freshman year. I'm walking across campus, and I see a sign that says, "Take 2 journalism classes in Mexico City for $425. I had $450 in my bank account, so I went to Mexico. And I fell in love with being in another culture. I thought it was amazing to see things I'd only read about in books. I had experiences I had never had before. I was journaling back then, and I rode a subway for the first time. My chief of staff gets mad when I tell this story because it's pretty embarrassing when I go back and reread it, talking about how, bright-eyed I was about being on a subway. And it was an experience that had an impact on me, so I decided to add international studies as a minor. My second year in school, in my first international studies class, I had a guest lecturer who was a former CIA officer. He told the most amazing stories, and that began my interest in the CIA. So when I graduated from Texas A&M, much to the chagrin of my father, instead of going to work for IBM, being a software engineer, I went into the CIA and was a case officer. So I was the guy in the back alleys at 4 o'clock in the morning collecting intelligence on threats to our homeland. I did 2 years here in D.C. area, what I used to call the super secret CIA training facility called The Farm, and now it's on Google Maps. I did 2 years in India, 2 years in Pakistan, 2 years in New York City, and then a year and a half in Afghanistan, where I managed all of our undercover operations. Now, in addition to collecting intelligence, I had to brief members of Congress, and I was pretty shocked by the caliber of our elected officials. So, as my mama always said, either you're part of the problem, part of the solution, I decided to move back to my hometown and run for Congress. And I lost. I lost by 700 votes, which is not a lot of votes, by the way. But it gave me an opportunity to become a partner in a consulting firm, help start a cybersecurity company, and we helped companies grow in markets they had never been in before. I had a number of clients in Mexico, spent a lot of time down there and really understanding the business relationships between Mexico and the United States was important. Opportunity came to run, and I took it. And for my district, the 23rd district, which goes from San Antonio to El Paso, 2 time zones, 820 miles of the border. It takes 10 and a half hours to drive from one corner of the district to the other at 80 miles an hour, which is actually the speed limit in most of the district. My chief of staff found out 2 weekends ago it's not the speed limit in all of the district. But trade, NAFTA is the number 1 or number 2 issue in my district because the communities that I represent live and die by trade between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. And why are we, I'm going to go ahead and answer the question up front. What would happen without NAFTA? It'd be pretty terrible, right? We all know, in this room we all know that our 3 economies have grown almost 300% since the signing of NAFTA. Everybody in this room knows that the U.S., Mexico, and Canada, we build things together. Right? You've all seen those stats about how in Canada, 25% of the inputs into a Canadian good comes from the U.S. That number is 40% when it comes to Mexico. And if you compare and contrast that with China, it's only 4%. We build things together. Yes, jobs are created from exports, but they're also created from imports as well. Just ask Toyota in San Antonio, Texas. And why are we at this point today where we have to contemplate something as terrible as what would happen without NAFTA? We're here because sometimes we forget to talk about things we take for granted. You know, after the last election and realizing I'm gonna get a lot, in trade a lot, in discussions around trade a lot more, I took some econ classes in college, but I need to brush up a little bit on the economic history of this issue. And I read this book called Against the Tide. And it talked about the economic thought prior to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which was written in 1776. And basically it was like reading the headlines of the current papers, which was crazy. We have to, for those of us that understand and care about trade, we can't stop talking about this. My dad always taught me to have a PMA, a positive mental attitude. I do believe that when this is all said and done, NAFTA 2.0 is going to be stronger and better than it is today. It's going to be really uncomfortable as we go through this process, and a lot of people are going to get scared and nervous before we get there, but I do believe we will ultimately get there, and something that Congress can ultimately pass and continue to strengthen, and so that we can start talking about North American competitiveness. But we can't stop talking about trade after we have a successful negotiation. We have to talk. I always tell my friends in Mexico, everybody in the United States of America has eaten a tasty treat from Sara Lee. But nobody knows it's owned by Bimbo, a Mexican company. Rossini is a great Mexican company. They're creating thousands of jobs in Michigan and Ohio. And people in those areas don't know that it's a Mexican company that is creating those thousands of jobs. We have to continue to talk about the importance of trade. We can't ever take that for granted. And that's why I appreciate the Atlantic Council highlighting and focusing and having these kinds of discussions. I wish I would be able to stay a little bit longer and listen to what our panelists have to say today, but I appreciate y'all being here. And look, yes, the negotiations are ongoing, but this is going to come, something's going to have to come to the House and the Senate for a vote. We need people talking. We need people reminding our elected officials that trade is not just a border issue. Trade is an issue that impacts our entire country. So thanks for highlighting that, and God bless you, and may God continue to bless North America.
Thank you, Congressman Hurd. Don't worry, you'll be getting another invitation back to the Atlantic Council sometime very soon. Thank you very much for your insight and your perspectives. I now have the pleasure of introducing one of the country's foremost authorities on trade issues, Ambassador Bob Zoellick. Ambassador Zoellick is somebody who all of you, I'm sure, know very well. He's held a number of important posts, President of the World Bank Group from 2007 to 2012, U.S. Trade Representative from 2001 to 2005, Deputy Secretary of State as well from 2005 to 2006. I think there's probably a few positions that, Ambassador, that you have not had. He's a recipient of several awards, including the State Department's Distinguished Service Award and the Aztec Eagle from the Mexican government. On a personal note, back in 2013, 2014, Bob, I saw firsthand your incredible insight and ability to decide complicated issues when participating in CFR's North America Task Force that you co-led with General Petraeus. As someone who deeply understands trade and the importance of our trilateral relationship, his comments are instrumental at this critical moment. The ambassador will give some remarks. He will then take a question from the audience, and then don't worry, he will have more insight because then he will sit down and join the panel afterwards. So with that, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Bob Zoellick.
Well, thank you, Jason. And I want to thank the Atlantic Council for highlighting the risks of losing NAFTA. I think it's a serious risk, which is why I came here today, and I think there's huge implications. I have to compliment Congressman Hurd. He's the future. He's the sort of person that we're really going to need in the U.S. Congress, because he obviously has got sophisticated international background. He's rooted in his community. He understands the U.S. Interconnections with the world. I appreciate his positive mental attitude. I hope he's right, but over the decades, I've learned to also be cold and calculating about the risks. So I'm going to give you some of the risks today. I'm going to make 5 points and then draw some quick conclusions. First, keep in mind what's at stake. Yes, it's about NAFTA, but there's much more. This is about a vision of North America in a global system. The big idea behind NAFTA, when it was first launched, was how all 3 countries could better compete and prosper and enhance security in a world that was shifting at the end of the Cold War. It's about the notion of deeper integration, but with a very important codicil, and that is all 3 countries have a strong sensitivity to their independence and sovereignty. So where the Europeans came up with the notion of shared sovereignty, NAFTA is very much based on the principle that you need to respect sovereignty while still trying to pursue integration. Here's the potential power of North America. 3 democracies, over 500 million people, energy self-sufficiency and even exports, more secure borders, integrated infrastructure, stronger manufacturing, agricultural, and services industries interconnected across sectors, better demographics than the European Union, China, Japan, if we invest in the workforce and figure out how this workforce, with respect for notions of citizenship, can cooperate together, and also close cooperation on regional issues, whether they be Central America in the south or the Arctic in the north. And ultimately, wrapping this together, looking at North America not just as a relationship with Mexico or Canada, but looking at it as a continental base for whatever challenges are going to be ahead of us in the 21st century. Interestingly, for those of you that have some interest in history, it's not a totally novel idea. William Seward, man that bought Alaska, the man that was Secretary of State for Lincoln, actually starts to talk about this idea before the Civil War, a voluntary notion. This is even after the U.S.-Mexican War. A very important idea about how the 3 North American economies and countries can cooperate in the future. Second point, Trump's hostility to NAFTA is premised on a core belief that bilateral trade deficits are like negative net income. It's, to him, losing, and you know what he thinks about losing. Now, the problem with this core belief is it's economic nonsense. You will not find an economist, maybe Peter Navarro, and I don't know where he's been relocated, maybe Peter Navarro, but you will not find an economist that believes that bilateral trade deficits tell you much of anything. Now, let me give you some practical examples. The United States has a surplus with Australia. Australia has a surplus with China. China has a surplus with the United States. So what have we learned? We've learned the comparative advantage of economies. Or a more basic form. I have a bilateral trade deficit with my supermarket. I don't stock shelves at night to have an offsetting account. I make money somewhere else and pay the supermarket. Even at the level of global surpluses and deficit, different than bilateral, which is fundamentally driven by savings and investment in an economy, keep in mind, the United States had a surplus in the 1930s. We also had 25% unemployment. So my suggestion is, rather than gauge your policy on bilateral trade deficits, I would look at growth and productivity and employment and incomes and inflation. But that's not the administration's approach. So third, as someone who's been through lots of negotiations at different levels, how do I see what the U.S. negotiators are trying to do to achieve Trump's objective? Well, first, they're trying to open markets to U.S. exports. That's good. Interestingly enough, they're using the provisions from TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Trump rejected, which suggests you already have one possible conflict. But then if you piece together the different proposals that have either been put forward or presented to the Finance and Ways committees, they basically amount to this. The U.S. wants other countries to open up their markets, but we don't want to be constrained by rules. So they want to do away with Chapter 19. Now, not to get too techno-wonkish on this, Chapter 19 is the provision that sets up a separate dispute settlement mission for anti-dumping countervailing duties. So either selling below costs or subsidies. I worked with Secretary Baker at the Treasury Department when we negotiated the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement in '87 and '88. And the Canadians spilled blood on this to get this done. Okay? It is a very big stretch in my mind to believe that any Canadian government can walk away without a Chapter 19 provision. As many of you know, there's possibilities under the U.S. and WTO rules to have a safeguard under certain conditions, if you have injury, and to have a temporary raising of tariffs or other barriers. The free trade agreements the United States negotiates exempts free trade partners from that. Trump administration wants to get rid of that. We have investor settlement and dispute settlement mechanisms. The U.S. position is, let's be able to opt out of those. What's quite interesting is also the discussion of creativity in dispute settlement. And what Lighthizer is really talking about here is, for those of you that remember the difference between the GATT and the WTO, the GATT will have panels. They had no ability to enforce panels. WTO rules said you either come into a compliance or the other party can take action. So basically they want to be able to block a dispute panel that goes against them. Or then the idea of a 5-year sunset. So who's going to invest if you're going to lose this within sort of 5 years? Keep in mind, rules can help the United States too. What's quite ironic and interesting is, if you look at the original NAFTA, there are provisions that state that the accord has to be in compatibility with the constitution of each party, that notion of sensitive to independence and sovereignty. Mexico changed its constitutional provisions on energy. That provision was partly there to protect the politics of energy. And given the ratchet up, what that now means is that the changes that the Peña Nieto government put in place on energy are obligations of Mexico if López Obrador wants to change them, but not if we exempt people from rules. So all of a sudden, the benefits for U.S. companies and others with the energy changes in Mexico, historic changes, could be lost. Now, there's another technique that you see the administration pursuing, and that's to set market shares. So this is basically the idea that, as opposed to having rules that try to adapt to new changes, digital, e-commerce, and others, and have fair competition, we want to get the outcome. We want to eliminate a bilateral trade deficit, and then you manipulate the rules to try to achieve it. This has been tried before. I encountered this. This was called Comic-Con. This is what the Soviet Union did with the barter arrangements. It won't work with modern market economies. Now, Mr. Lighthizer had some experience with this. He tried to use this with a semiconductor agreement with Japan in the 1980s, where Japan was required to have 20% market share of US semiconductors, which they dutifully bought and threw away. Another technique is called the voluntary restraint agreement. So countries are not supposed to do this under the WTO. In the 80s, the Japanese did this with autos. They said they'll restrain the number of cars that they will sell into the United States. Japanese figured this out. As opposed to having lower value cars, they had Lexuses that moved up the value added chain. Markets adapt to distortions of rules. Then there's another technique you'll see that looks very technical and sounds, oh well, maybe rules of origin, okay? Keep in mind, if you believe in free trade, you will buy something regardless of whether it's made in the United States. It doesn't have to have any share of origin in the US. The rule of origins that the administration is playing with is not North American rules, it's US share. So, doesn't it sound a little bit like central planning? What share has to be the US? 10%, 20%, 25%, 30%? How do we determine that? That is centralized planning. To take another case this morning at breakfast, my wife was discussing the effort of the administration to protect Whirlpool from Samsung appliances. I have a practical case. We used to have a Whirlpool washer, and it was crappy. My wife brought a Samsung one. So in a very practical way, she says, I want to be able to buy the washer and dryer that I would like to be able to work. Why shouldn't she be able to do that? Will that be good for American competition? So keep in mind, these things can be turned on the United States. We've got farmers that sell corn to Mexico. Should 10 to 20% of that corn be Mexican? Why not? If you're going to have 10 to 20% of something else. Natural gas. We want to sell natural gas to Mexico. Should 10 to 20% or 30% or 40% be Mexican? You can see where I'm going with this. It won't work. And that leads to the fourth point, and one that I hope I'm wrong, but I want to be very open because I think this is a very serious risk as I look at how Trump guides policy. If the objective is to eliminate a bilateral trade deficit, and the U.S. has, say, a bilateral trade deficit of, say, $60 billion with Mexico, Lighthizer has to somehow sit down, or with Wilbur Ross, and say to Trump, have we had provisions that will eliminate that? You can't do it. Therefore, I think there's a very serious risk, depending on what happens with Trump's popularity and the investigations, that at some point he'll withdraw from the agreement. Now, why do I in part believe this? I had a conversation with Henry Kissinger earlier this year, and he said, you know, Bob, he said, in my experience, presidents want to be successful. And so I think Trump will move towards the norm. And my response was, it depends how you define success. If you define success the way Kissinger or I would, that would be true. If you define success as responding to applause or political realignment, then look at where Trump tends. It'll be anti-immigrant, it'll be wall with Mexico, it'll be protectionist on trade. These impulses are not going to go away. So I hope that I'm wrong. I hope that they'll work something out. But be prepared, and if you're the U.S. Congress, be prepared to push back on this. Now, here's the fifth point to test the seriousness of the renegotiation. How would Trump pass this with the Congress? I was in the Bush 41 administration. I was part of the team that negotiated NAFTA. We completed the agreement. President Clinton took it up, made a major effort in '93 to be able to get that through. He had Democratic votes. He relied heavily on Republican votes. But I had to be a vote counter. I had to pass TPA. I had to pass other types of agreements over various times. Ask yourself, where will the Democrats be on a renegotiated NAFTA? My guess is, since they're striving to get back the white working class vote, that they'll be more protectionist than Trump. They'll say, you didn't do this, you didn't do that. What's quite interesting is the polls show that the average Democratic voter is now more free trade, but not the average Democratic congressman. The Republican caucus is more split than it was, say, when TPA was passed with the efforts of Speaker Ryan in 2015. But can you really imagine President Trump going to the Republican Congress and saying, look, I really need you to get NAFTA repassed? I don't know, that doesn't quite ring to me. And by the way, he's pretty inept in dealing with Congress anyway. So I don't think if you renegotiate it, you get it passed in any event. But tell me where you think the votes are. So the best outcome from my point of view is for Congress to assert its constitutional power and to try to delay and stop what will be self-defeating actions. And this is a message for the business community, the farm community, everybody that cares about this relationship. You have to press these people because there's always a tendency to hope it'll all work out. I've lived in a practical world where I hope for the best, but man, I got to prepare for reality as I see it. Now let me close with this point. Let's understand the broader strokes of this. I first started to deal with Mexican foreign policy in the 1980s. One of the former journalists here from Mexico we used to talk about these issues. And if I had to know Mexico's foreign policy in the 1980s and I didn't have in a briefing paper, my fallback would be to find U.S. policy and put a minus sign in front of it. Now, why was that? Because under the old PRI system, the foreign ministry was the home for leftist intellectuals. Nice life, got to travel, somewhat cultural, can engage in anti-Americanism. If anything was serious, Los Pinos would sort of control it. But look how that changed. When I became U.S. Trade Representative in 2001, my closest partners, not only in North America, but in trying to open markets around the world, were my Canadian and Mexican counterparts. The difference intellectually about trade and open markets was minuscule. We had politics we had to deal with in different areas, but our mindset was very, very similar. I was struck when I was at the World Bank, and I forget exactly the issue, but I remember talking to Chancellor Merkel about a U.S. position, trying to get it done internationally. She said, you need more developing countries support. And I said, well, Mexico supports. And she said, Mexico? She said, well, of course Mexico is going to support the United States. And I thought, what a change. That wasn't the case 10 years before that. Or look at societal ties. Go check the lists of rosters of people in the U.S. Marine Corps and ask how many of them are Hispanic names. And frankly, a lot of them are Mexicans. They're not Mexican Americans, they're Mexicans. That's what we're creating in North America. Those are the people, whether it's the DACA or others, that are going to create the future of this. And we're going to crush it if we follow this guy. So whether the cooperation is on illegal immigration, now mainly from Central America, organized crime, narcotics, smuggling, anti-terror, we're at risk of destroying a bipartisan 30-year policy to build a strong, healthy neighborhood. And why? That's the question that you and others are going to have to address and answer over the next year. And I think it'll be a very real question. So now you get to ask a question, right? We have a question or two? Before the panel, anybody have a question? Such a subdued audience. Yes, sir. And maybe if you give your name and where you're from.
Sure. My name is Carl Schwanen. I'm with the Software and Information Industry Association. So my question is under NAFTA, I think provision number 20, any country can withdraw, and there's a 6-month period for it to go into effect. If a country, if the United States does that, what is the posture? What should the posture be of the U.S. Congress? Because you said the Congress should take action. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm having a discussion on this tomorrow with one of the senior staff of the Ways and Means Committee. It's a big question, right? And as you properly point out, under the negotiating authority, there's a 6 months notice provision. In most of the free trade agreements, the tariff authority is in the executive's hands. This goes back to the experience from the Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act of 1934 and the reversal of protectionism. There's some things that are put in statute, but most likely, even though Congress has constitutional authority over trade, the president has authority to end these agreements. But we know how congressional executive relations work. Under TPA provisions, you're supposed to clear various provisions with the Ways and Means and Finance Committee or the Agriculture Committee, so there's ways you could impede that. Congress has appropriation power. Congress could pull the current TPA, not that that would stop this agreement or withdrawing, but it could stop a future agreement, because while TPA is passed as legislation, it affects the rules of the House and the Senate. And under the Constitution, those are both in control of the House and the Senate. And then there's the process of hearings and the zillions of ways in which Congress can tie up an executive branch. So I'm hoping that some members of Congress who share the view that NAFTA and other free trade agreements or the Chorus agreement with South Korea are important will start to make life miserable for Wilbur Ross and the White House and for Bob Lighthizer. And trust me, I've been there. They can do it. But legislatively and statutorily, probably limits to pulling out from an agreement the ability of Congress to stop that. But ultimately, they could shut down the negotiating authority, too. Okay?
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your comments. Before moving to the panel section, I'm going to pick up just the Ambassador's comment about kind of the broader effects. And the last section of this report we're launching today looks at something that we're not talking about as much these days, but really the non-economic benefits of NAFTA. As many of you know, trade agreements they're of course economic accords, but they also very much serve strategic purposes. Look back at 1985, look back at the U.S.-Israel Free Trade Agreement. They bind countries together in ways that would not be possible without the glue of intertwined economies. And today we sometimes take for granted our strong relationship with Canada and Mexico, but as the ambassador says, that was not always the case. It wasn't until only a few decades ago that the U.S.-Mexico relationship began to evolve from mistrust and suspicion to really one of cooperation and partnership. And this is a point that we make in this report that we won't touch on as much on the panel, but I think it's important to highlight that we can't risk, whether with Mexico or Canada, the potential of even a slight reversal of the collaborative diplomatic, intelligence, narcotics, security, and immigration efforts that have grown over the last couple of decades. NAFTA is a force multiplier for jobs, competitiveness, and investment, as the panel will discuss. But that cooperation has also helped to make the United States more secure, and we cannot even hint at risking that. So today, as North America, as we point out in the report, we secure borders together, we dismantle organized crime together, we engage in military training together, we tackle migration together, and we further energy security together, and we cooperate on a range of additional issues beyond that. Successful NAFTA renegotiation, of course, is of top economic importance, but the effects will be felt far beyond the economy. And of course, we are bound by geography, but geography alone was not what's going to be critical for making the U.S. and North America overall more secure. I think it's an important point, gets lost in the discussions today, but it's a byproduct, I think, of what NAFTA has helped to accomplish. Now, before introducing our panel, I'd like to thank Javier Mancera's firm, De La Calle Madrazo Mancera, for its partnership in this effort, as well as Nuevo Alianza, which partnered with us to host a conference in the Mexican Congress in July to share preliminary findings. And of course, thank my Associate Director, Catherine Pereira, who led this effort from this project from the beginning. Now, before starting the panel, I want to bring in some technology. We put together a 90-second video that provides a quick snapshot of what NAFTA means and why successful renegotiations are so important. So let's watch this video quickly, and then we will start the panel. That video is available online as part of the report launch, and it's also on Twitter. So as you're tweeting during the event, feel free to use the hashtag ACNAFTA and share this video more broadly. I'd like to now welcome to the stage our panel. Please feel free to come up to the stage as I'm introducing all of you. Please come on up. It's an all-star group that is sure to provide some fresh insight through, and Bob, you as well, please, through the moderation of Jennifer Leonard. Jennifer, sitting to my left here, is an associate editor at Inside U.S. Trade, where she's extensively covered NAFTA and trade matters and just spent some quality time up in Ottawa for round 3 of negotiations. Jennifer will dig into key issues with the authors of the report, along with Ambassador Zoellick. The authors include, from your right, Javier Mancera. Javier is the director and founding partner of CMM Consulting and the author of the Mexico section of this report. He previously served as Minister for Trade and NAFTA Affairs at the Embassy of Mexico to the United States. Next to Javier is Philip Levy. Phil is the author of the U.S. section and senior fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He was senior economist for trade in the Council of Economic Advisors under President Bush. And next to Phil is Daniel Schwanen, Vice President of Research at the C.D. Howe Institute in Toronto and the author of the Canadian section of this report. I'll say publicly, it's been such a pleasure to work with all of you as part of this effort over the last few months. Thank you very much. Congratulations on an excellent report. And Jenny, look forward to your moderation today. Please join me in welcoming the panel.
Yeah, thanks for being with us, everyone. I would like to start with you, Phil, as the U.S. co-author of the report, and maybe we can walk through where NAFTA started with the elections in November. There was looming uncertainty. Then the administration in June received a lot of comments after there was sort of a silence from the business community that didn't really take a position on NAFTA. Then we received comments, we had public hearings. The administration came out with its negotiating objectives. Can you walk us through basically this shift in the current political perspective? And do you see the uncertainty that we saw in November prevail now still?
I'll take the last thing first. I think we do have a lot of uncertainty. I think I share Ambassador Zoellick's concerns. I think we may look back fondly on a time of uncertainty, depending on what comes next. But in terms of how we got here, I think you're right. We trace this back to the elections. One of the things you see if you look out, the plight of American manufacturing workers drove a lot of this angst. And I think, and the question is, you have populations where they used to see a clear path to sort of middle-class success, that you'd get a factory job, you'd work, and you'd get a pension, you could put your kids through school. And I think a lot of families and communities saw that closing off. And then the question is, why? I think a lot of evidence points to technological change, and that would be a separate discussion. But there's technological change, there's domestic competition, but what has been held responsible for a lot of this has been trade agreements, and NAFTA in particular. If you look at the share of the labor force in manufacturing, you don't even see a blip in 1994. It's a process that was starting at least back in the mid-1960s, and yet it was contemporaneous with this. And so you had something of a competition between both parties to see who could, with Democrats usually winning, who could hold this responsible and claim to be serving the public needs. I think President Trump won that competition in terms of being more anti-trade, anti-NAFTA, anti-TPP. We didn't know how it was going to play out. I think Ambassador Zoellick was right. There's a deep desire to do something about this. We saw that with the sort of aborted attempt to sign an executive order. And I think when that happened, we saw finally, as you said, the business community and the agricultural community did speak up. They did come out very loudly and say, no, this agreement is really important to us. Mm-hmm. Where are we now? You're right, they put out negotiating objectives. Those weren't as helpful as you would have expected because they didn't really resolve anything. It wasn't a, how do we reconcile this interest and that interest? It was more a listing of all the interests, some of which seemed irreconcilable. And so we've had 3 rounds of these negotiations. The most difficult issues, the ones that seem hardest to reconcile, haven't yet been put on the table. Mm-hmm. So where we sit now is about a week or so away from seeing when it all hits the fan, where they actually are going to have to say, what do you do about bilateral trade deficits? And I thought Ambassador Zoellick put it excellently. Speaking as a card-carrying economist, he's got it exactly right. That that ought not to be the focus. It is, and it's going to make for very, very difficult negotiations.
Yeah, I wanted to, on the trade deficits and the negotiations, I'm going to dive into that deeper later. Javier, can you give us the Mexican perspective? Obviously, the Peña Nieto government has outlined its 10 main goals. Its election is like approaching fast. Do you think with the recurring withdrawal threats, these goals have changed in any way or might change?
I don't think so. I think that the goals of the Mexican negotiators are the same, which is mainly to avoid managed trade and to look into newer chapters more than redesigning existing chapters in the agreement. Particularly, I would like to point out to the importance of Chapter 11 and Chapter 19 for to discipline governments. One, as Ambassador Zoellick mentioned, is on issues of countervailing and anti-dumping. And the particular notable issue of these two articles is that they allow for private right of action. And it's always a bit surprising for me to see a U.S. Republican administration taking away a private right and having companies have to go forward and ask for help from elected officials whenever they want to fight something elsewhere. So I think that these two provisions of the NAFTA that enhance the power of the private sector when another country acts function very well in disciplining what countries do, and they're quite beneficial. But I see Mexico looking at, I see the Mexican negotiators having a similar interest in having a solution to this negotiation sooner rather than later. And that has to do with the political environment. The political environment in Mexico, given that we're having a presidential election next year, that early next year we'll have we'll be running a complicated election, that for the current administration, they would love to have this chapter closed before that gets in. But I don't see how, given your TPA legislation, that can be done.
Another question we're going to dive in deeper, because I think everyone is wondering how we're going to wrap this up by early next year, how it's going to pass Congress. So Dana, can you give us the Canadian take? Was Canada interested in renegotiating this agreement, or were they kind of pushed into, and what actions have been taken to safeguard the Canadian interests in those negotiations?
Well, Canada already has, or had, prior to the NAFTA, a bilateral agreement with the United States, which notionally is still on the books and could be revived if necessary. That's kind of a weak plan B, but in reality, Canada made the determination at the time of the NAFTA negotiations that we preferred very much a trilateral deal, that the three countries working together could strengthen the competitiveness of industry in the North American continent as a whole. And as you may know, we also made that determination in the TPP, which is, okay, let's join those negotiations. So I think Canada has a bias towards multilateralism and bigger groupings for all kinds of good reasons of maybe differences of size between Canada and the United States. But also because deep down, I think there's a general consensus in Canada that this really does help, that trade really does help standards of living and productivity, ultimately competitiveness vis-a-vis other groupings that are emerging, frankly, around China and Europe. So we were pushed into these particular negotiations, perhaps, but conceptually, if someone had come to us and said, well, let's modernize NAFTA, or let's go into the TPP, as did happen, we'd be right there and happy to contribute to that effort. Canada, what we've done is very simply fan out across the United States, and it's not very difficult to find U.S. firms that depend on Canada for inputs, but also on Canada as a market. It's not very difficult to figure out Canadian foreign direct investments in the United States and the 600,000 jobs they contribute in the United States. And I think we've been marshalling those interests and being very active. Our government officials very active, of course, engaging members of Congress to make them realize how important trade with Canada is with the U.S. So that's Plan A, and we don't really want to talk about Plan B, I think.
Not yet. Ambassador Zoellick, you already touched a little bit on how the first 3 rounds have gone so far. What are you hearing? What is progress being made, and what are the main sectors pushing for? And I think a question that I have and a lot of people that I talk to have is, who has the president's ear or USTR Robert Lighthizer ear in these negotiations, given what proposals have already been put on the table and what we're hearing will be put on the table?
Well, as I suggested, I think there will be some market opening proposals. There's a lot you could do to modernize NAFTA. People who want to be hopeful will look at that, energy sector, digital, e-commerce, put environment and labor in the agreement. Those are undoubtedly part of the U.S. agenda. But as the second stage, as I mentioned, is I've cited about 4 or 5 examples of how the U.S. doesn't want to be bound by the agreement. I think that's going to be, I won't speak for the Canadians and Mexicans, but I wouldn't be surprised if they reject that. And then third, there's the whole effort to try to have some sort of market share arrangements. Maybe people can play somewhat with rule of origin without fundamentally damaging it. There are other things that Mexico and Canada could agree with if the administration wanted the appearance of a change. So for example, currency and exchange rates. Fred Bergston at the Peterson Institute and Joe Gagnon wrote a very interesting piece without getting all the details about the connections of exchange rates and trade, and it's always been a hard thing to kind of how they would connect in trade agreements because people were afraid of the effect on monetary policy. They've come up with some calculable approaches that frankly you could put in this agreement, wouldn't affect Mexico and Canada, but would be a precedent for the future. But this comes down to your belief on who do you think runs the administration. I think Donald Trump is the guy who runs the administration, and I think Donald Trump has an antipathy towards bilateral trade deficits, and I think it goes to his sort of core political support, as I mentioned. And therefore, it's very hard for me to see how, given the set of things that I think Mexico could agree with, or Canada could agree with, that Trump repackages this and says, oh, I've solved the problem. I think it's far more likely that he has his own fights with his own internal team. And look, one of the fundamental differences here is that, look, he's ambivalent about alliances too. But I think that the generals around him who come up in a culture and their careers have been developed in an alliance framework, that he will kind of grudgingly accept it, but he'll preserve his right to take shots at him. So the Afghan agreement, for example, you saw how he was dragged into that. We'll see where that is in a couple years, because I don't think there's going to be a fundamental change. But in the trade and economic side, you don't have that sort of counter and support system. Wilbur Ross shares the same view that I mentioned for Trump. Wilbur Ross, I've heard him say this, says, look, after the United States did NAFTA, the trade deficit increased. Yes, the trade deficit increased. So did manufacturing jobs. You had a big boost of growth in the 90s. This is what you have relative growth rates, right? He then saw trade deficits increase after China entered the WTO. Similar set of characteristics. That one was probably even driven more by exchange rates. So he draws a simple correlation and thinks that this is the driver of trade policy. So I think we're headed to a fundamental sort of crack up here, and it partly depends on whether the Congress makes it painful for the administration to go in this direction. One last point here to connect it, because there's this assumption all the time that the American people are against trade. The Chicago Council just put out a series of reports. Attitude towards trade has gone up over the past year, right? And frankly, even if you saw in the midst of everybody dumping on trade in the 2016 election, in general, the support for TPP was about 60%, same with TTIP. Opposition sort of in the high 30s, people who wanted to pull out of NAFTA, I forget whether it's your poll or another, was 14%. Okay, now it's an intensity issue, and that goes to the point. Trump is playing to the base, and frankly, this is now a question of whether the people who benefit from this, so what the Atlantic Council is trying to get focused in here, will speak up. Look, I could never get the Boeing aerospace workers to support trade. You figure that out, okay? 90% of their product is sold abroad, okay? But they're against trade. Mike, I'm just drawing a blank, the USTR, Mike Froman, and I could never get the congresswomen from Silicon Valley to support trade, okay? Why? Because the tech companies didn't really focus on trade. Now they probably realize international rules matter, so maybe they'll focus a little bit on trade. This is grassroots politics, okay? And if businessmen who benefit from trade don't explain it to their employees, the farm community has gotten agitated. The farm community understands this. And so it appears that one of the things that stopped the one withdrawal from NAFTA was Secretary of Agriculture going in and pointing out, here's the districts that export to Mexico and Canada, and by the way, a lot of them voted for you. So this is going to have to be a grassroots effort. This is not just a technical effort.
To follow up on this, you said that President Trump is trying to play to his base, but what sectors of the business community have his ear or Robert Lighthizer ear and sit down at USTR and say, we want these provisions? Or is the administration tone deaf to those sectors, given what they have put out so far?
Well, if Phil may have a better sense of this. Look, that's the sad thing. Steel, okay, if you want to build the future on America's steel industry, these are the guys you want, right? If you want to focus on technology or exports or sort of other future sector, maybe an 80-year-old Secretary of Commerce isn't quite plugged into all those issues, okay? So, and frankly, the real answer to your question is the business community is now being forced to choose, okay? They didn't want to do this. Look, I chair a company that has $500 billion plus investments. I look across the economy. I understand this world, okay? But here, look at what happened. The tech community was the first to break because of the issue of immigrants and visas, right? And then they went to, say, a company like IBM that was also tech, but also did a lot of government contracts. So they were a little wary of breaking, right? Then we had Charlottesville, and all of a sudden, all the business advisory groups, those sort of came apart. So CEOs are now in a very uncomfortable position. They're not used to doing this, but they're going to have to decide, are they for something or against something? And interestingly enough, this is again where these sort of discussions may be helpful. Their customers care. Their customers don't like it when Mexicans are referred to as rapists. They don't like it when disabled people are mocked, okay? Younger people think this is not necessarily the future, okay? And then their customers care, their employees care, and so all of a sudden you're seeing executives having to figure out a little bit, maybe we have to be positioned differently. And I personally believe over the next 6 months, companies that rely on NAFTA are going to have to decide, do they draw a line with this administration or not? And we'll see.
Javier, on the outcomes of this agreement so far and how it's benefited all three economies, we've heard a lot about trade balances, rules of origins, and jobs. What were the economic effects on Mexico? And what are we trading, and how does this benefit the U.S.?
Well, NAFTA has been, for the three countries, a huge success, even in the terms of the original negotiators, is well beyond what they dreamt. But NAFTA, from the very beginning, was kind of politically touchy in the U.S. And I think it's very important that we understand, and I'm going to get to your question, but following on what was commented by Ambassador Zoellick, is that NAFTA in the three countries is domestic politics. And that makes it a little bit complicated on how it's managed, because trade with China, WTO, that's perceived as foreign policy in the three countries. NAFTA is domestic for the three countries. Mm-hmm. So that makes it has specific political challenges that have to be overcome in each country. Mexico was able, because of the NAFTA, to have an increase of 40% in its population, and nevertheless keep a slightly higher working wage. When people criticize the NAFTA results in Mexico, they mostly criticize the issue of wages. When a country is able to absorb 40% more workers and keep average wages with a similar, little bit more buying power, it's truly, I think, a great success. Normally, when you see an influx of workers of that size, you will see wages deteriorating big time. It was because of Mexico liberating its economy, the overall liberation of the Mexican economy. It's not only NAFTA. NAFTA is it's symbolically, it's the anchor of the Mexican liberalization process, but it is not the whole of it. And this has allowed Mexicans that used to have, came from subsistence farmer families, to become urban dealers and workers, and have a much more higher salary or earnings that they would have had if they have stayed in the farm. So when people say there's an unfairness, of course Mexican wages should grow, and they will grow, and they will grow mostly not because whatever can be negotiated in an agreement. I don't think you can negotiate increases of wages in agreements, constitutions, laws, or whatever. The market is the market, and when you have enough workers, if you have too many workers, then it's going to be, the wages are going to be, tend to be lower. When you are shorter of workers, then you will have higher wages. Mexico, for its first time in its history, Mexico has now a positive a population pyramid that would allow most Mexicans to be of working age and be able to pull Mexico fully into as a developed nation. That could not be done when in the last 20 years, when you had a huge amount of under 15-year-olds that and a smaller part of the population there, and a smaller part of the population had to upkeep that. If Mexico messes up this negotiation, or whatever is Plan B, if we have to have a Plan B, what we have to keep up is we need to keep our markets open. We need to lower our duties in a very important way, so that we don't become Argentina, okay, where they had that same blip, but because of protectionism, now they have an older society that lacks the ability to really be competitive. So Mexico has an opportunity to do this right. I hope that if the US pulls out of the agreement, Mexico's reaction is to deepen liberalization, but politically that not might be the case.
It seems like they're going for that route anyway, to liberalize and diversify their economy.
Yes.
Daniel, on Canada, how has NAFTA benefited the Canadian economy?
Well, Canada is not a low-wage economy and doesn't want to be, and nobody really wants to be in that category. And but we have a number of manufacturing industries. We have, of course, a thriving resource sector that does help maintain high-wage jobs, even for lower-skilled individuals. But we had a manufacturing sector prior to free trade with the United States and the NAFTA that was, in a sense, fairly weak and protected by high barriers in a number of sectors, whether it's textile, clothing, furniture, a number of low-tech industries. And we were engaged in multilateral negotiations at the time, and we saw the pressure to open the Canadian market to some of these goods that frankly can be made more cheaply and even efficiently elsewhere. And the calculation, well, how do we maintain a high-wage Canadian economy? Is it by opening up and exporting what we're doing best and working with our trade partners to get the best inputs so that we can have the most productive industries and in turn export? And indeed, that's really what would happen. The calculation was that's actually the best way to maintain a high-wage Canadian economy. That's actually what did happen. Now, there were job losses in those sectors that I mentioned and others, very significant. But I think it's fair to say that without those deals, today Canada's industry would be far less competitive. And so, I think the calculation worked out. How does this impact the United States? Well, we're more integrated, and very concretely, that means that practically nothing gets made in Canada without a lot of U.S. inputs. And I want to emphasize that. We signed a trade agreement just very recently implemented with the European Union. Well, part of that agreement was, and I'll just leave you on that example, part of that agreement was, well, how do we export cars duty-free to Europe? Because we have this car manufacturing base. And the Europeans said, well, no, but 40%, 45% of your cars contain US input or Mexican input. So that doesn't work for us. And so we negotiated a quota of cars assembled in Canada with US input, maximum input, that were able to enter duty-free into the European Union, because otherwise we couldn't benefit from that agreement, and they understood that in the end. So that's a specific example of the benefits of integration. And maybe I'll mention also that Canadians spend a lot of money. So whatever money we make from exports, we spend a lot of that in the United States. So, but maybe I'll have a chance to mention the enthusiasm of Canadian shoppers for cross-border shopping a bit later on.
Maybe you can go buy some things after the meeting. Oh.
For the United States, there are many sectors that have benefited from NAFTA, like the agriculture sector. In the headlines, they're dominated by workers' complaints. So what's the verdict? Is the United States better off now with NAFTA?
Yeah, I think the U.S. is clearly better off with NAFTA. I think it's worth remembering, we sort of lose track of this, what NAFTA did. That if you take the starting point, NAFTA was not the moment when the U.S. opened up to trade with Mexico. U.S. average tariffs on Mexico and Canada going into the agreement were 2.7%. Now, sure, that was on the back of a free trade agreement with Canada, but even on Mexico, they were around 3%. We were a fairly open economy. The brilliant job that our negotiators did was they got fairly high Mexican tariffs, which were on the order of 15%. So they dropped by about 15%. We dropped by about 3%. A pretty asymmetric deal, but still a reasonably good one. As you said, it helped a number of sectors. And I think some of what makes this hard to perceive is we sometimes got our benefits in what didn't happen. So for example, we didn't have the collapse of the North American auto industry. We've had a consolidation, they've certainly had tough times, but the fact that you've gotten the efficiencies from the integration of the North American auto industry, that's what's allowed it to stay competitive in a really fiercely competitive global market. And if you look at all the other regions of the world, the Asian region has its low-cost suppliers, often in China, to do parts of the production. This is the trend that we've seen in trade, is a product made in one place or the other place. It's components and the global supply chains. You've seen that in Asia, you've seen that in Europe. NAFTA was part of what allowed for a competitive auto sector. The other thing is, I think we've seen that U.S. businesses thrive when they are allowed to engage in free competition with fair rules. NAFTA laid the groundwork for a lot of those rules, and that extends actually well beyond North America. So if we want to look at the benefits, they're certainly there in North America, but as Daniel has talked about at other occasions, when the Canadians went and talked to the Europeans, they said, we have to do this because these are the rules we agreed with the U.S. Ambassador Zoellick, when he was U.S. trade representative, went out and negotiated a whole slew of trade agreements that built upon this, that sort of set this as an example. And of course, the novelty with NAFTA was you often had developing countries say, we shouldn't have to open, we should be able to stay closed off. NAFTA set a precedent that said, no, you really should be open to American goods, you will benefit from competition, you should set aside this protectionist ideology, and that's been greatly to American benefit.
Ambassador Zoellick, if you could briefly say what's the single biggest impact that NAFTA had on the United States? I know you probably have a lot of thoughts here, but
Well, the single biggest impact is to overcome a century of enmity with Mexico that creates the basis for cooperation in ways that we've seen over 30 years, but we can only begin to perceive and foresee over the next 30 or 40 years. Keep in mind, I'm not saying NAFTA was the sole basis of this, but at the end of the Cold War, the one-party state, the corporatist state of the PRI, was quacking. The model of that was basically Italy in the 20s and 30s, where everything had a place, the labor unions, the universities, everything in the structure. The real question that was going to be facing Mexico and the United States was that as those pieces cracked, where would they go? What would be the model that they would connect to? We have models of failed states, we have organized crime, we have, you could see this in whether it was what Colombia had to face, or Panama, or others, or Argentina, or Brazil model. And Ms. Fuentes was an early journalist, and we first met when she was starting to represent, was it El Norte or the other? The Reformer. Look, when I first went to Mexico, a lot of the journalists were on the take. Okay, Reforma and El Norte decided to become, frankly, North American journalists, different standard of openness and trade. You go through the university system, you go through the businesses. Now, this is not complete. This is the whole issue of the organized criminal networks and narcotics and others. But the real question is the United States going to be better off with a healthy, democratic Mexico that sees itself in partnership with the United States and Canada with whatever the issue is in the future? Climate change, security issues, terrorism, or others? Or do you want to make them into enemies and insult them? I don't know, that seems to me to be a pretty clear, sense of direction. But I want to come back to the point that as much as it is Trump, this is where the issue is going to be critical for the future. You go back at the Obama administration. Remember when Obama was elected, he was going to renegotiate NAFTA too, okay? And part of the problem, and this is true across the American political spectrum, but frankly, it hit more the Democratic side, is nobody would speak up for NAFTA. I've had to advocate a lot of things in my life. And one of the things I've learned is if only one side argues in an argument, it's a little hard to win, right? When I talked to people in the Obama administration, they were banned from talking about NAFTA because it was seen as a political loser, okay? This showed up in their overall trade policy. They did nothing in the first term, zilch, total waste. In the second term, thanks to getting Mike Froman in, they started to push TPP, but even then they said, we don't need TPA. Fundamental mistake, fundamental mistake. Congress wants to play. Keep in mind, Congress passed TPA in 2015. If they had just gotten TPP done a year earlier, you would have TPP in place today, okay? Now the reason why this is relevant is that if people who care about trade and openness and the connection to the society don't stand up and make the case, you're going to lose the debate. And there's another connection here that's quite important we haven't mentioned, which I spend a lot of time traveling all around the world, so I spend a lot of time in East Asia. In East Asia, first off, they kind of wonder, why the heck did we abandon TPP? We're trying to make the rules for the future, right? But they are watching NAFTA. And frankly, in East Asia, they say, if the United States is so stupid as to screw up its agreements with its continental powers in Mexico and Canada, what can we in East Asia expect from these guys, right? That's a realistic question. So what's at stake for NAFTA is certainly the efficiency of the auto industry, where parts are crossing 13 or 14 times, and our farmers and on and so forth. But there's bigger stakes here about the US and the world, and we're going in the wrong direction.
I have so many questions about your report. I have questions about the ongoing renegotiations, but I also really want to open this up to the audience, so why don't we go to questions now? And maybe you guys can ask about that. But well.
Thanks, Will Malden with the Wall Street Journal. Thanks for having this, Jenny. I had a question about the increasing tensions with Canada. If we could delve into that a little bit, Mr. Schwanen or Mr. Zoellick or the others. Prime Minister Trudeau is coming next week, and there are a lot of issues within NAFTA, like Chapter 19, dairy issues, but also other issues from Boeing and Bombardier clash to softwood lumber. I mean, what level of trade conflict are we on with Canada? Is it DEFCON 3? Is it the worst since the War of 1812? And our no, but seriously, put it in perspective, if you wouldn't mind. And our Prime Minister Trudeau and President Trump equipped to deal with it, and how will each of them attempt to do so? Thanks.
Thank you. So I guess that was for me. Can't avoid it. Can't avoid it. So I think in the context of a conversation, if the context of the conversation was we want to make trade easier and we want to increase the trade flows, and that involves removing certain barriers that Canada has. That may be that we subsidize too much, and that's unfair. That may very well be, and I would tend to agree that we have some outrageous agricultural barriers that remain. And those things, I think, could be agreed on. So we might even consider, and certainly I'm not speaking for the government, that should be, it's going to be obvious by what I'm going to say, which is that we might even consider backing off from the demands on this dispute settlement mechanism, Chapter 19 in the NAFTA, regarding anti-dumping and countervailing duties, to have independent panels assess whether the determination of U.S. agencies follow U.S. law. So that's really what these panels are determining. As Ambassador Zoellick said, we paid a lot in the initial agreement in terms of opening our market in order to get that kind of assurance of an impartial hearing. Nevertheless, you could conceive of an agreement where we have a bit of an agreement on subsidies, what's fair, what's unfair, where we have an agreement on competition policy, what's fair or unfair competition, that may make Canadians and Americans, I think, feel that we are fair, that we trade fairly, and that we don't need maybe these kinds of dispute settlement mechanisms. But all of that goes back to, so you could conceive of an agreement on all of these issues where Canada would have to back down on some of our protectionist measures. However, you could conceive of that in the context of a discussion about opening trade, and not so much about in the context of which is, I think, really is the heart of the tension that you refer to, in the context of a discussion where really, Canada's the bad guy, but we're going to become more protectionist vis-a-vis you, and we want you to become less protectionist. I don't think that really works.
So here's how I would address it. President Trump is a different type of president that I've certainly worked with, and he doesn't look upon U.S. systemic interests. He looks upon interests as individual transactions and deals. He welcomes uncertainty. He will welcome impulsive action. A lot of it is personal, whether it's related to the family and others. So I think Prime Minister Trudeau had either an analytical or instinctive sense of this, and so he's tried to develop the personal relationship. My guess is he will continue to try to find areas of comedy, and perhaps if he could talk about how he'll support the United States on North Korea or other issues that he knows are on Trump's agenda, right? And then he will offer, make positive sounds about things they can do to open markets, and my guess is he'll kind of reserve on things that he sees as very confrontational until he kind of sees the direction of this. Is Trump just blowing off steam, or will he be putting it sort of at risk? So I don't think it'll be a definitive meeting. It'll be a personal relationship positioning meeting, but he'll probably also, based on the relationship, try to gently put down some markers to say we can only move so far. And he will realize that the fundamental issue won't be with Canada, it'll be with Mexico.
Gentlemen, you're saying that you're making a call to Congress, basically saying that they have to speak up. What will a Mexican congresswoman, man, do to make the NAFTA become part of the discussion, apart from what Nueva Alianza had done already, which was hosting this and the report? And what can teachers do? What can Mexicans do to be part of the constructive discussion of making this a clear path to being considered an ally rather than an enemy, which is at the bottom of what we're talking here?
Is it okay? Are you? Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, look, the fundamental test of the United States now is that we have a system. China is going to have a core leader in October, okay? We don't have a core leader. We have a president, okay? And we have a separation of shared powers, and it's the House and the Senate, and it's governors and states, and it's private business, and it's nonprofit groups, and so on and so forth. So I think the Mexican government has actually figured this out, as most governments have. They have to work all those elements. So they need to make sure they're in touch with the agricultural community in the United States to say, look, we don't want to have a clash. We like your food, but if you're going to screw us, we're going to have to go buy from Argentina and Brazil and others, you know. And we have our own politics, we have our own needs, so on and so forth. And you got to go to the states where you've got business. And governors, unlike members of Congress, have to do real stuff. They got to make investments work and others. And you got to have the people who invest in different states and say, this is going to create an incredible backlash. And by the way, we got a presidential election, and we may have a presidential candidate who wants to move us back to the 50s. You know, so the implications of this are huge. And by the way, their net numbers of Mexicans coming in are going the other way, but we'd like to help you with Central Americans. But if you make the United States our enemy, well, then, you know, get ready for the flood of people, because I can only do so much with my politics. So you have to work all the different channels, and including the businesses that have good relationships, to say, look, you know, let's get beyond the, you know, nice talk, complacency, this will all be well. This is dangerous. This is risky. That's why I write the pieces I write. I'm trying to get people to wake up, right? And so I hope I'm wrong, but I'm telling you, I've been doing this for 30 years, and I do pretty good anticipation and probabilistic assessment. I think there's at least a 50% chance that Trump pulls out of this thing over the next year or so. And so therefore, you have to work all elements of the system. Okay?
If I could just add, I think that's very, very well put. The thing I would add, first, praise for the Mexican approach so far, in the sense of resisting sort of pretty blatant provocations throughout, and sort of taking a very sort of level-headed approach. I think this is the challenge that's facing both Canada and Mexico, is that we have this, you know, lack of constancy. I mean, the earlier discussion about how Canada would respond, we've seen this from U.S. policy. When you have the personal visits, all of a sudden we have no problem with Canada. Absence doesn't make the heart grow fonder. All of a sudden Canada's a problem again. And so it's how do you play this? Do you accommodate? Do you confront? And it is a real challenge given the vagaries of U.S. policy right now. I would say that to date, Mexico's done a really admirable job.
Oh, by the way, this goes back to your question too a little bit. If you can find things that make Trump look, I don't like this, but if I were advising you, if you think that makes Trump a winner, that don't cost you anything, then do it, okay? So I was in Mexico a couple months ago. I was invited down by the head of the central bank, who's one of the best central bankers in the world, by the way. That's another example of how the system has totally changed. And he's now all going off to the BIS. And I sat down with some of the Mexican ministries, and I said, look, the starting point is realize you're not negotiating with me, okay? This isn't a rational discussion about how we open markets, right? If you can make him look like he's won something and it doesn't cost you big, you know, do it, okay? We're in the world of appearance here. We're in the world of applause. We're in the world of playing to somebody's ego as opposed to sort of rational economics. Now, I have to say, it's a little painful, having worked with the Mexicans for 30 years, to get them to move in our economic logic of markets and free economies and so on and so forth. And now I'm basically saying, oh, well, you know, that's, you guys can do that. We're going to go in another direction. I mean, you know, it's ridiculous. But that you have to realize Trump is a different type of president. So without giving up fundamental things, you know, play to his ego and sense of success and hope you can get through it.
Thank you. I'm Guy Erb from the Berkeley Research Group. I think building on what the ambassador just said, the Mexicans and the Canadians are going to face some very difficult proposals next week. And I think that they'll be unacceptable, and it really will frame your responses in terms of what happens next. And I think you may find it better to prolong the negotiations. Just admit you're not going to make it done by December 21st or January 21st. Prolong and delay may be your best tactic.
I think that's a difficult call because the president has repeatedly said that he wants to blow this up. I'm paraphrasing, but not much. I mean, he said, this is what I want to do. And then the question, I think there has been a bit of that. You saw the South Koreans try this, that when the U.S. came to them and said, we're really worried about bilateral trade deficits, they knew what Ambassador Zoellick knew, what economists know, this is a little bit off balance. They said, yeah, let's study that and we'll do this. You came very close to having that agreement blown up. So that's the question, is how do you balance that off? You're right, playing for time can be a strategy, but not if it leads to sort of frustration and detonation.
There's a news story about Korea today, and it'll be interesting to know. What it looks to me is they've actually put it into a process that's within the agreement as opposed to renegotiating it. So it looks like it's a little bit of the spin strategy, but there's things you could do to make things look better, right?
On the timing, maybe we can open it up to Javier, because how much of a hard line is early 2018 for Mexico? I understand your question was maybe we can prolong the talks, but is there even an option for Mexico? Or how much is ready?
I personally agree that prolonging is a good thing. Now, as Phil says, we've read about whether we hear what he says or not, and therefore I think that Mexico and Canada and the United States should be ready to act upon him acting under 2205 and deciding to jump ship. Now, whether it is a negotiating perspective or that he feels compelled, the U.S. feels compelled that that's the way to go forward to get Mexico and Canada to acquiesce to particular demands. The problem is that those particular demands cannot be addressed in a trade agreement, and that's the main problem. It's not. I'm very much into providing fig leaves if they do their job, but the problem here is that the issue of the particular issue of deficits and how to address a deficit in a trade agreement are without some sort of peculiar managed trade that at the end is going to be cheated by somehow. Businessmen always find a way to go around whatever politicians design. That's why free trade works, because it limits a number of rules and allows a private sector to do their job. If you try to design the businesses in a table, Mexico tried to do that for many years. Never works. The Soviets did the same. It seems that this Republican president wants to do the same. It's just peculiar, but I don't see how that can be done. The same as jobs and wages. Those are not issues that you can deal with in a trade agreement. It would be great if we could sign papers to get results that we want from a policy standpoint, but it's not that easy.
I'm being told that we have to wrap this up, but a really quick poll that I've been doing at every single NAFTA round, and it's looking a little sad. Now, you said more than 50%. What are the chances 2205 will be triggered either as a negotiating tactic to get the Canadians and the Mexicans to agree to something, or actually because he really doesn't care about NAFTA? Just really quick a percentage. I'm really interested in that.
I gave mine.
Yeah.
Well, I'm Canadian, so I'm going to say 50-50. So 50%.
Okay.
The odds of 2205 is triggered. I'll be an optimist. I'll say 40.
Look at you.
I think all of you are optimistic. I think it's more probable than not that he does it.
That's basically what I've been hearing also from the business community. So Thanks for hosting this to the Atlantic Council. Thanks for all of our panelists for being here. And sorry we couldn't get to more questions.